Hello, my name is Will Green, and I'm one of the pastors and the director of Discipleship at Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. This series, titled Lectures on Lament, was designed to help deepen our understanding of the experience and expression of Christian lament as a spiritual discipline. Together, we will explore the deep gifts that both individual and communal lament hold for the life of discipleship, and identify concrete ways to incorporate it into our daily lives. In this third lecture, Dr. Denise Dombkowski-Hopkins, Woodrow W. and Mildred B. Miller Professor of Biblical Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary, explores loss, grief, and chronic sorrow in the biblical Psalms of Lament. In so doing, Dr. Dombkowski-Hopkins offers the listener language, framing, and insight into the ways Scripture helps us access and explore the experience of lament. Dr. Hopkins has been a speaker at Foundry in the past and is a much beloved part of our Foundry Women's Retreat and Women's Retreat community. And so, Dr. Hopkins, we are so glad that you've taken the time to be with us today.
Oh, thank you, Will. I'm very, very happy to be here. And I still remember that women's retreat out at Priestfield. It was absolutely incredible. So those of you who are on that retreat, hello again. And I hope to see more of you in the future. Okay, I am delighted to be here, and I have put together this slideshow with the title Psalm Laments in This Time of Grief. And I am grieving, especially because of the death of the husband of one of my longtime colleagues at Wesley, Kevin Hogan. He's the husband of Lucy Hogan, who used to teach preaching at Wesley. He was only 70 years old. And I just read something in the Post today that 1 in 3 people in America have lost someone that they know and love to COVID, 1 in 3. So I think we have to look at Psalm Laments in this time of grief. And to talk about grief, we need to define it. And basically, grief is our response to significant loss. And normally we think of grief in connection to the death of a loved one, but grief is not confined to the death of someone we know. Our world is grieving now in many different ways. Can someone share with me? We already mentioned COVID. The Washington Post saying 1 in 3 people in America know someone either close or an acquaintance who has died of COVID, 1 in 3. It's absolutely an astounding figure. So we're grieving, yes, the deaths of people from COVID. What else are we grieving? Anyone?
Loss of trust in our political leaders.
Thank you. Loss of trust in our political leaders, perhaps in our democracy. Perhaps we're grieving the breakdown of Congress. That is really in the category of political reality for us. It's being questioned. What else are we grieving?
The continued loss of interpersonal just relations and interactions with people. We try to make a facsimile with Zoom, but it's still not the same.
Thank you. So interpersonal relationships, even the sense of touch. The sense of touch. I am blessed because I am a relatively new grandmother for the first time. My granddaughter is almost 15 months old. And because my daughter and son-in-law are quarantining, as am I have helped care for her since she was born. But if I hadn't had that, I really would do. Her hugs, her smiles, her kisses, that's just absolutely priceless. So we're grieving loss of interpersonal relationships, particularly. Well, I'll talk more about that in a little bit. What else are we grieving?
Freedom to go and come and get out to further away from home places.
Okay, freedom to travel, freedom to eat at a restaurant, freedom to talk to a neighbor on the sidewalk. So our normal patterns of life have been disrupted, and we're grieving that. What else are we grieving?
We're grieving the loss of being able to gather and mourn when someone close to us dies.
Yes. Funerals that are virtual. I have one on Monday for Kevin Hogan. I can't hug Lucy, his wife. That coupled with the fact that so many people have had to die in a hospital alone. And the only touch they had was from wonderful nurses and doctors who were with them in their last moments. What else are we grieving?
I grieve the difficulty in our churches to be together in difference.
We're grieving a sense of being able to talk to one another, to be together in the midst, despite our differences. And I think that applies also to the political scene as well. We have divided ourselves into very clear camps, and the ability to communicate between those camps has been very much reduced. Okay, so we've named several types of losses that you see here, and this list is from Mitchell and Anderson in a wonderful book called All Our Losses, All Our Griefs, which is very old, but which most pastoral care people still cite today. Griefs, in terms of types of losses, can be of many types or kinds. Material loss. And here I'm thinking of people who have lost their jobs in the pandemic and who are being evicted, or renters who are being evicted from their apartments. The loss of a house or a special possession has hit us very hard this year. We grieve also the loss of role, be it from retirement or divorce or from losing our jobs. What do we do now? That we're grieving also the loss of relationships, parents in decline, job layoffs, our working environment comrades. We no longer see them face to face. We also grieve systemic losses. And here I want us to think of shifts in city populations, rural populations, structural and wealth inequality. There's also functional loss due to paralysis or dementia or loss of hearing. And then finally, intrapsychic loss, which several of you have referenced. The view of oneself, of the future, of the world has been turned upside down. And for some people, it's been shattered. Some people have lost their dream and their sense of purpose. So think about all these losses as we look at the lament psalms. I want to recommend to you, if you haven't been referenced, if you haven't been given a reference to this yet, a book by Melissa Kelly called simply Grief, Contemporary Theory and Practice. And Melissa in this book talks about three particular kinds of grief: disenfranchised grief, chronic sorrow, and grief born of injustice. Let's take a look at each of these to kind of set the stage for the psalm laments.
Why don't you turn this off?
Grief that is not openly acknowledged, socially validated, or publicly observed is disenfranchised grief. And here Kelly is quoting Doka, who came up with this idea of disenfranchised grief. Basically, people people with disenfranchised grief do not have the right to grieve. Oops. There is examples of disenfranchised grief would be miscarriage, stillbirth, suicide, death of a gay partner. And as I've already mentioned, the death of someone from COVID in a hospital setting, which means that funerals have to be very private and very small or postponed altogether because of COVID restrictions. So disenfranchised grief is a difficult one that so many people are experiencing. Chronic sorrow is the grief of ongoing loss from mental illness, from PTSD, from Alzheimer's. And I put up a COVID slide here. Why? How does COVID contribute to chronic sorrow? Anybody?
The death toll keeps on rising, and there's this sort of ongoing loss of life across our nation.
Okay, so if there's no closure with a funeral, a proper funeral, if you can't be with the loved one when he or she dies, there is no sense of, I hate to use the word closure because grief is always an ongoing process. My brother drowned at age 23 when I was 27, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him and mourn his loss. Of course, in a different way after all these years, but nonetheless, he's always on my mind. But I'm also thinking of the long haulers who have gotten COVID and seemingly recovered, but still 3 months or 6 months later are experiencing brain fog and aches and extreme fatigue. They're called the long haulers. That is a sorrow that never ends because it seems that this COVID never goes away.
Well, that's one of the others. It's an ongoing sense of danger.
Yes, an ongoing sense of danger. And I think sometimes that those who resist wearing masks, that the real underlying reason for their refusal to wear masks is that masks remind them of what? When you see a mask, what does it remind you of?
Your vulnerability.
Your vulnerability, that you could die from COVID. Yes. So who wants to see a mask on everyone they meet and to be constantly assaulted by the reminder that, hey, you're going to die someday and it might be sooner or later?
Well, personally, I want to see a mask on every single face that I meet, so I won't feel that way.
Exactly.
That face scares me.
Yes, exactly. I am with you 100%. And because I'm especially vulnerable, I almost died from pneumonia several years ago, and I have lung scarring. I am very careful about masking. But I think there are people who cannot face their mortality by seeing all of those masks. And it is a kind of twisted thinking, but I can understand it. And then this one, which no one has really touched upon yet, grief born of injustice. And that grief is caused by unjust structures and by the accompanying inaction on the part of groups and systems. And it is actually grief that is preventable. That is the kicker for this kind of grief. And Kelly says that one example would be global poverty. We can do something about global poverty if we choose to do so that it did not have to exist, but we don't. That is grief born of injustice. I want to have us think about two other very important examples of grief born of injustice, and I gave you a hint in the slide. What am I talking about?
Sexual harassment.
Yes, sexual harassment, rape, #MeToo, Survivors March. Here's a slide from CNN. The injustice of male-female relations in this country, and please know that not only women are raped and sexually harassed, but men are as well. So this is not a gender-specific problem and form of injustice. However, the statistics for rape in women are absolutely mind-boggling. So here is an unjust structure, this idea that women can be preyed upon. And I just read an article in the Post about a Texas public school system doing away with its assignment in high school on chivalry, in which the young women in the high school classes were to go to extra lengths and document them, not to upset the young men in the class, to cook for them and basically to show the kind of chivalry that was in place in the Middle Ages. And I read it and I was absolutely incredulous, and there was a hue and a cry, and the assignment was discontinued. But that's a structure that's being cultivated at a very young age that contributes to #MeToo. And in terms of laments, Psalm 55 has words that speaks to those who have been victims of rape. And in verse 4, it says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Truly, I would flee away, far away. I would lodge in the wilderness." So here you could imagine words that give voice to the trauma that someone who has raped has experienced, so much so that this person wants to be a bird to fly away into the wilderness. And the wilderness in the Bible is a place of danger and of death. That's how badly this person wants to extract him or herself from the situation of a danger that they're in. So here we see how Psalm laments can give voice to trauma. What is another example of grief born of injustice that has been in the news all year?
Racial inequality.
Yes, racial.
Police violence.
Police violence, Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement was born of grief fueled by injustice, centuries of systemic injustice. And I believe, I don't have another slide for that. The Black Lives Matter movement has really given a wake-up call to this whole country and precipitated a whole wave of re-examination of our cultural history, our political history, that is long, long overdue. And I'm struck, particularly because Ginger just preached on penitential laments. In Psalm 51, which is tied by the superscription to King David, but I don't think King David wrote the song. I think perhaps he may have prayed it. And I will point out that he says, if David is praying this psalm, "Against you only, God, have I sinned." And I want to say, excuse me, David, but you forgot about Bathsheba, Nathan, and your unborn, and your child who died. So it's a really incomplete confession from a feminist womanist standpoint. But in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, verse 5 of Psalm 51 is very, very important. It reads, "Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me." A sinner when my mother conceived me. And so many commentators have said, oh, that's about original sin. Well, there was no original sin in Hebrew Bible, and that thought wouldn't have even been in David's head if he were praying this psalm. I would like white people in this country, in terms of recognizing their own white fragility, to think about being born guilty as being born into white privilege from the very moment that we were conceived, and we saw our doctors who were primarily white, and we were born in hospitals where physicians are primarily white, and where through our whole lives we are surrounded by and take advantage of white privilege. I think that verse can speak to that. And I'm convinced of that after reading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. And in one chapter, she describes what it's like to be born white from the minute we're conceived all the way up through the time that we get married and beyond. It was quite chilling. Okay, so we have a caution here, and that caution is that we have to be careful about offering up platitudes to those who are grieving. We can give, as I and my colleague Michael Koppel in Pastoral Care have written in our book, Grounded in the Living Word, the Old Testament and Pastoral Care Practices, we can give superficial assertions that stifle further story exploration for temporary assurance and comfort. And we do that all the time, but I think we do it primarily for our own comfort and not for the comfort of those who are grieving. And when we do that, when we offer up platitudes like, well, give me some example of a platitude. What do we say to people when they've lost something? Either a loved one, a job, a role.
They're in a better place.
Yes, they're in a better place. I got that at my brother's funeral all the time. And my response was, their better place was right in our family, right by my side. Yes, what else?
It is God's will.
It's God's will, part of God's plan. And my response to that would be, oh, I'd like God to reconsider that plan. Thank you very much. What else?
He or she is no longer in pain.
She's no longer in pain. That one's a good one because we don't want to see our loved ones suffer. As Lucy Hogan said about her husband, Kevin, his body simply could not take it anymore. He was in and out of the hospital 3 times and on a ventilator for about 2 weeks. So his body could not take it anymore. What else?
You're being tested so that you can do great things later on.
Yes, you're being tested. And it'll make you stronger. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? And how many people have said to me, oh, look at the wonderful things you've done with Psalm laments in your life after your brother's death. And I don't hesitate. And I say, in a nanosecond, I would give all of that up to have my brother by my side. He wasn't consulted about being the agent of all these good things that I've done. So we get an idea of what these platitudes do, right? Might make you feel better, might make you able to make sense of the world, but I'm not sure it's very helpful for the one experienced loss because it dismisses the lived experience that the grieving one is in the middle of. Kelly in her book says we can offer up, for example, Psalm 72, verse 14, from oppression and violence, God redeems their life, and precious is their blood in God's sight. And there refers to the righteous. So to this woman in Psalm 55 who wants to flee from the oppression that she has experienced, well, God is going to redeem your life. Well, easy for you to say, because you're not the one who has been raped. It's questionable comfort, especially if grief is preventable. And Kelly makes a very, very strong statement that I endorse. We must understand grief care as sometimes encompassing both pastoral response and prophetic action. In other words, put your money where your mouth is. Walk the talk, okay? And I think the laments are about pushing people into prophetic action. I wanted to say, before I go on, one more thing about disenfranchised grief. I just saw an article in the Post last week about patient zero. I don't know if you all saw that. Bonnie Lipa calls herself patient zero. She's the first person in the Washington, D.C. region to have been officially diagnosed with COVID. And she got it from taking a cruise on the Nile River in Egypt. And she talked about, she actually lives in Las Vegas now. And I think she moved in part because her life here was hell. She said that strangers on social media were vicious to her and blamed her for the spread of COVID in the Washington, D.C. region. She was a pariah in social media. And today, people ask the question, how did you get COVID? As if you did something wrong. Now, I will say some people have done something wrong, like gathering in large gatherings without a mask. Yes, you're asking for it. However, I noticed in the obituaries in the Washington Post that many people who probably died of COVID do not list that in their obituary. And I think it's partly because of this continuing stigma that patient zero talks about. So let's talk very briefly, and I don't know if Ginger has talked about this, Walter Brueggemann's Seasons of Faith. Will, has she mentioned this in her sermons?
No, she's not.
Oh, okay. Walter Brueggemann long ago talked about seasons of faith, out of which and into which we are constantly moving in the course of our lifetime. And sometimes in our professional life, we're in one season. In our personal life, we're in another. It's in a constant state of flux. The 3 seasons are listed here. The season of orientation, which is when we're feeling good, when we can say God is good all the time God is good. We live in a steady, no surprise world, at least in our experience. God seems to be in control. The righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. And we get this orientation expression in hymns to the Creator, such as Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Hymns to the God of Zion, Psalm 46. A mighty fortress is our God is based on Psalm 46. Psalm 1, a wisdom psalm. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could all live in orientation all the time? Let's just see a show of hands. How many of you feel as if you're living in a season of orientation right now? And Will, I can't see. Is anybody raising their hand? And it's okay if you do, because I want some of that to rub off on me. Will, is anyone raising their hand?
Absolutely. I'm seeing a few raised hands.
Okay, that's wonderful. Please spread that around, please. The majority of you, I would wager, are somewhere else. And I would say many of you are in the season of disorientation. And that's a season in which we find the order of our world is shattered. And we are experiencing emotions such as anger, despair, doubt, depression, isolation, guilt. And those emotions are expressed in the Psalm laments. And then finally, the season of new orientation is the season in which we experience the gift of new life, just when we thought no new life was possible, when we were in the pit, as the laments call it. And these Psalms are the Thanksgiving Psalms that express this new orientation, such as Psalm 30, you've turned my mourning into dancing, and the enthronement Psalms. And the enthronement Psalms we use during Easter, rightly so. Sing to the Lord a new song, the Lord reigns. So I leave it to you to decide where you are, but I want to share with you this sketch that's on the cover of my Psalms book, Journey Through the Psalms, that was done by Chris Serdick, who was a student of mine at Wesley, retired United Methodist pastor. And it represents 3 figures at prayer, and the 3 figures are meant to express the seasons of faith that Brueggemann talked about. Now, could you all tell me which figure do you think expresses orientation? Anybody?
The tall figure?
The tall figure, this one with the arms outstretched. Why is it? What is that figure conveying to you?
An orientation toward the Savior, toward uplifted arms, reaching.
Okay, so if new orientation is about Thanksgiving and about recognizing that the Lord reigns, then this could be a person who basically says, hallelujah, with arms raised, right? And again, this is art. I'm not going to tell you what you have to see here. Any other possibilities for the figure of orientation?
The one on the left.
Yeah, the one on the left. Why?
I'm pretty content. Looks satisfied. Calm.
Yep. Satisfied, calm, content. Those are the hallmarks of the season of orientation because things are going well for you. And notice particularly the hands. Now, those hands could be folded over the chest in a prayer posture. Those hands could be spread apart in a prayer posture, in a gesture of praise to God. But those hands could also be folded across the chest as a way of saying, my space is nice and ordered. Thank you very much. Could you take your messy disorientation and push it over there, please? I don't want to catch it. Okay. So the season of orientation can be very off-putting to those people who don't experience it at the moment, right? And when you offer up a platitude from your own position of orientation, you are really dismissing the experience of someone who is in disorientation. And in fact, Brueggemann says that the church is too often a speaker of orientation to people who have no idea what that looks like, because their lives have been one disastrous, traumatic event after another. Okay, which figure do you think represents disorientation? Anyone?
I could make an argument for both figures on the right, because one is kind of bowing down and maybe that's in disorientation, but also the taller figure could be wailing.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. The one bowed down to me looks as if he or she is in the fetal position. And that for me is a sign of complete despair. But the one on the right very easily could be, oh my God, why? Right? What is it about the figure at the bottom? What is it conveying? What emotions? Anyone?
Defeat.
Defeat, yes. Defeat. What else?
Agony.
Agony, absolutely. You're doubled over in pain. Anything else? How about depression? I don't even have energy to lift my head. So again, these figures are very suggestive, and you look at them, and I ask each of you, if we had time, we could break up into small groups, but we don't. An hour is not very much time. And you could talk about which figure represents you today and why. But make that decision for yourself right now and spend some time with that figure. I want to also set the stage for laments by talking about two categories of testimony in Hebrew Bible that Walter Brueggemann has named. And in case you don't know, I think Walter Brueggemann is the most important biblical scholar of the last 100 years, period. He has done more to bring the Bible into the lives of us everyday folk than any scholar at all in the last century. Brueggemann talks about Hebrew Bible as a collection of testimonies about God and Israel's experience of God over time. And two primary testimonies are these: core testimony and counter testimony. Core testimony is what we believe is true of God over time. And we see some examples here. God saves, God creates, God hears, God heals, God loves, God forgives. Look at all those action verbs, right? What could we add to that list in terms of core testimony, in terms of what we believe God is and does over time? Anything else?
God redeems.
God redeems, yes. What else?
God cleanses.
God cleanses, yes.
Judges. God listens.
God judges. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Do you know how many people don't want to add that to core testimony? That yes, God judges, which is a good thing for those of us who have been wronged. It's a bad thing for those who have been carrying out the wrongs. Yes, so that's a touchy one. Yes, God listens. I always picture God with huge Mickey Mouse ears. What else?
God liberates.
I'm sorry?
God liberates.
God liberates. Yeah, the primary paradigm for Israel's experience with God is the Exodus. And that paradigm makes its appearance in the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. And for Jews, that is actually the first of the Ten Commandments. For Christians, that is the prologue, the introduction to the Ten Commandments. I think the Jews got it right. I think that should be the first commandment because it's out of this declaration, this testimony about the God who liberates, that those commandments make sense. All right.
God
Yes.
sees. God sees.
Yes, good one. That's an important one. God sees. El Roy, the God who sees. Hagar names God, the God who sees. In Moses' call narrative in Exodus 3, God says, I have seen the suffering of my people. And that does not mean, oh, I noticed it. I've taken it into myself. I am in total empathy with it. That is an incredibly active kind of seeing. That's a great one. Okay, so that's core testimony. And which Psalms in the book of Psalms would be expressing core testimony? Psalms of orientation, right? Psalms like hymns to God as creator, Psalm 8, Psalm 104, Psalms like 46 and 48, a mighty fortress is our God, the wisdom Psalms like Psalm 1. That's core testimony. But counter testimony is a huge part of Hebrew Bible, and your Pastor Ginger has been making that clear in the time of Lent. Counter testimony grows out of lived experience. And that testimony is full of questions and doubts. Questions like why, questions like how long. And how many people have been asking those questions in this last year of ours, not only because of COVID, but because of Black Lives Matter, because of the Me Too, #MeToo movement. Counter testimony is what we've been hearing primarily during these last 12 months. So that brings us finally to the Psalm Laments. Jesus' last words on the cross are my permission, as it were, to bring the laments into our worship life and into our prayer life. Jesus in Matthew 27 and Mark 15 called out, my God, why have you forsaken me? We could also translate that as, why have you abandoned me? And that is the first verse of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is a lament psalm. And again, let me remind you, what was the Bible for Jesus? Was there a New Testament in the time of Jesus?
No.
Please say no. No. Remember, the earliest part of the New Testament is Paul's letters, which were penned in the 50s CE. Jesus died in the 30s CE. So there was no New Testament for Jesus. His Bible was Hebrew Bible. He is quoting Psalm 22, which is filled with lament. These are the words that we need to take seriously in the time of Lent, especially this year, and not the 7 penitential laments traditionally used by the church, which are listed here for you. Except, as I said, I think Psalm 51 has some value for helping us to recognize white fragility. No, I blew it. Those of you who saw that slide, please don't respond. Take a guess. Tell me how many of the 150 Psalms are lament Psalms?
40%.
Very close. It's about 50%. And if we subtract, I'm sorry, did I say 50%? No. It is, oh my gosh, my math is cattywampus this morning. If it's 50 Psalms, it's a third of the Psalter. My bad. I have been doing my taxes this weekend, and I think my brain is numb. Okay, so if we talk about 50 approximately lament Psalms out of the 150, we're talking about 1/3 of the laments. If we subtract the 7 penitential laments, we're talking about 43 angry lament Psalms. 1/3 of the Psalms are laments. And Roland Murphy, may he rest in peace, said of this fact the following. He asks us this question: have we as Christians lost the art of complaining in faith to God? Notice that, complaining in faith. That is not a contradiction in terms. Have we lost the art of complaining in faith to God in favor of a Stoic concept of what obedience or resignation to the divine will really means? I can't tell you how many times I have heard military chaplains in the Doctor of Ministry program, which I've been teaching in since its inception, tell me that when we are suffering, we need to grin and bear it. And I remember telling those chaplains, if you told me that in my hospital room, I would throw you out of the room. Grin and bear it. That's the Stoic, stiff upper lip. God doesn't give you more than you can bear platitude about suffering. And Murphy says there's an art to complaining in faith to God. And it's actually built into the canon of our Bible. And we need to ask this question: is there room for the hurtful side of human experience in our worship? Thankfully, your pastor Ginger has said yes. That permission is not granted in many churches. I see it every year in my intro class. When we come to Psalms and Psalm laments, there are people who tell me that their pastor never allowed any of lament thinking in their worship services. So in how many minutes do we have left? We have about 15 minutes left. We're going to go very quickly through the lament structure to show you that lamenting is a process. It takes time, and it takes the community to be what Winnicott, the psychologist, called a holding environment for those who are grieving losses. You all, as the community of faith, are the safe space for people to offer up their angry laments. So you see here the parts of the lament structure: address, complaint, petition, and motivations. In other words, extra reasons given by the psalmist for God to grant this petition if the complaint didn't make the case to God. And then you see a dotted line in which, in many laments, there's a shift from all of this so-called negative emotion to more so-called positive emotions, a confession of trust and vow of praise, both of which are given in anticipation of deliverance that has not happened yet. And I remember when my brother died that I could really lean into the part above the dotted line, but I could not mouth the words below the dotted line. And the congregation had to do it for me, holding up a light at the end of the tunnel that I would move toward. So what is the address in a lament? Well, let's go back to Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Well, the words, my God, repeated twice, that is the address. It's short and emotion-packed, and it is a mini faith statement because it's identifying the one to whom the psalmist prays. You're not throwing a lament out into the universe. You are addressing it specifically to God. Why? Why do we bother to pray an angry lament? What is it that we believe about God? Anyone? Think about the core testimony and counter testimony we just looked at. When we say, my God, what are we assuming?
God
cares.
Yes, that God cares. Absolutely. What else?
God delivers.
God delivers. That God cares and has the power to deliver the one suffering. What else?
Listening.
God listens. God listens, and that is interwoven with God cares. God listens because
God restores.
What?
God restores.
Yes, God restores. We believe that God restores. So do you see the power packed into that address? The assumptions built into that address? You may accuse God of forsaking and abandoning you. That's your experience right now. But in the back of your mind, there's that core testimony that God cares, listens, delivers, restores. That is very powerful in the Psalm Laments. That's a declaration of praise in the middle of the season of disorientation. And for me, that's stronger praise than praise that comes out of the season of orientation. Then we come to the complaint. And why is the most frequent question in Psalm Laments? How long is a second most frequent question? The long haulers of COVID would ask that question. And so are Black and brown and yellow people in this country asking that question. How long will systemic racism endure? Enough already. And those complaint questions are usually full of reproach and accusation. They are not calm requests for information, but they're cries of pain. My God, why have you forsaken me? And the second half of the verse is, why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? That is a question coming out of the pit of disorientation. And we err when we...
My phone falling down.
They say what? What? I'm not sure. I didn't hear that last comment. But if we think that we can answer the question by talking about God's plan or giving up platitudes, we are so wrong. That only, again, dismisses the psalmist's experience and adds to the pain of the psalmist. Can you imagine telling Jesus on the cross when Jesus asked that question, oh, God didn't abandon you? Can you imagine that in the midst of his great pain? I hope you can't, because I hope you never do that. So there are focuses on either I or we, the psalmist or the community suffering, the enemies who are making the suffering worse, and a focus on God. So the focus on the psalmist's suffering is very vivid and full of metaphors. And the metaphors are often couched in terms of death or going down to the pit or to Sheol. And that picture on the slide is a picture of a cistern. There are a lot of spatial metaphors like going down to the pit. So in Psalm 88, which never ever crosses that dotted line to get to the more happy anticipation of deliverance, Psalm 88 says, I am counted among those who go down to the pit. You have put me in the depths of the pit. There's this metaphor, spatial metaphor of going down to the pit or to Sheol. And then there's a focus on the enemies, the they, and they're always vicious, and they're often compared to wild animals such as lions or mad dogs. And Psalm 17 gives us a good example of that. And again, these are all quotes from lament psalms. Psalm 17, verse 12, talks about the they, the enemies. They're like a lion eager to tear, like a young lion lurking in ambush. And that's a stereotypical language. And what's great about it is we particularize it with our own experience. So when I've done Psalm 17 in intergenerational Bible study, I got different answers as to who those enemies were. From the pastors in the group, it was the SPRC, the consistory, the church council, waiting for the pastor to mess up so they could get a no, we don't want this pastor here anymore. From teenagers, it was my parents who are waiting to ground me. From elderly people in the congregation, it's my adult children who are waiting for me to leave the gas on or forget where I'm going to put me in a nursing home. So you see how those metaphors work? They make room for a lot of people and different experiences. So we have enemy language that's very strong. And we're told in Leviticus that you can't hold a grudge against any of your people. You must love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus got that from Leviticus 19:18. Matthew 5 says, love your enemies. So what do we do with this enemy language? when enemies are characterized as having no pity, as tracking the psalmist down. What do we do when, for example, in Psalm 76, we ask that the enemies be like the snails that dissolve into slime. I'm a gardener. I flip on the lights at 10 o'clock and I use salt shakers to sprinkle on slugs that eat my plants, and their tissues burst because they absorb liquid because of the salt. So I get that metaphor from a gardening standpoint. Really? You want that to happen to your enemies? If none of you have ever thought that about your enemies, you are blessed, but I've had those thoughts. Then finally, there's the complaint focused on God, who is you in the Psalms. And normally God is addressed in harsh rhetorical questions because God is perceived as absent or acting unjustly. And that's the tough one for Christians. Enemies is tough, but this is probably the toughest. So Psalm 77, will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Are God's promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? What kind of testimony is couched in these rhetorical questions? Is it core testimony or counter testimony?
Counter.
Counter. These are questions that arise out of lived experience of God's absence. And when you ask, has God forgotten to be gracious, what core testimony are you challenging? Anybody? If you ask this question, has God forgotten to be gracious, what core testimony are you challenging?
That God even cares, for goodness sake.
Right. That God is gracious and that God does care and that God does restore and deliver. And are God's promises at an end for all time? That counter testimony is challenging what core testimony?
God is faithful.
God is faithful. God keeps God's promises. Absolutely. So look at these questions. And to ask these in the context of a worship service, I can't tell you how many of my students have said, when I asked those questions of my pastor in his or her office, they shot me down and said, you can't ask those questions of God because God is always gracious and God always keeps God's promises. And a lot of those students left the church for a while because there was no place for their lived experience of disorientation. So those complaints move into a petition, which is basically a plea for God to intervene. And it includes, rise up, wake up, hear my prayer, deliver me. And in fact, Psalm 44 says, wake up, why do you sleep? And that's a communal lament from exile in which the exiles think that God has been sleeping on the job. And that challenges the core testimony that God never sleeps. And here I bring in Shaniqua Walker Barnes, who talks about the SBW, the strong Black woman, who in traditional cultural understandings is supposed to suppress all questions, carry all burdens, take care of everyone. And Shaniqua suggests we might look at Psalm 22, verse 11, and ask, and have strong Black women ask, do not be far from me, for trouble is near and there is no one to help. In other words, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say these burdens are too heavy. So if you ever have a chance to hear Shaniqua Walker Barnes, please do. She's amazing. So if God's not convinced by the complaint and by the petition, confessions are often offered up. So there's where the penitential laments come in. And the confession of sin basically says that God is right to witness this suffering, but the psalmist realizes the suffering is caused by his or her own sin. I'm sorry, God, please forgive me and grant my petition for help. We're all comfortable with that because we enfold confessions in our weekly liturgy. But what happens if the motivation given is a protestation of innocence that says basically the suffering is not justified and that we're entitled to help? And some people say, well, that's self-righteous. Psalm 17:3, You have tested my heart. You have visited me at night. You have refined me. You will not find wickedness in me. My mouth does not transgress. My feet have held fast to your paths. How many of you can say that about people who have died from COVID, people who have died from police violence? A lot of you, a lot of us can say that. I can say this about my brother. There's no self-righteousness in this at all. It's really a statement that says, all things being considered, I've tried to walk the right paths. I've tried to be faithful to your way. And then motivation 3 is something I call the PR, or the public relations value of the psalmist. In Psalm 6, in death, there's no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can praise you? Psalm 88:10, do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? And remember, in ancient Israel, there is no heaven and hell. There's just Sheol, the place in the bowels of the earth where the good and the bad go to die. When they die, to exist as shades of their former self. So what's the psalmist saying? Hey, look, if you don't save me, I can't sing your praises for delivering me. You will lose someone who testifies to who you are with core testimony. And what does this mean? This means that the psalmist matters to God as one who praises. It also means that people are watching and God's reputation is at stake. People will say, where's that God of yours? As Psalm 10 and 44 do. And then finally, we cross that dotted line to the confession of trust, which is, as I said earlier, an expression of confidence in God despite or in the midst of suffering. And that confession of trust is expanded into a whole psalm, such as we find in Psalm 18 or the beautiful Psalm 23. One of my students called a confession of trust the second wind of the runner, which I like. And Psalm 13, which only has 6 verses and is a textbook lament psalm, says in verse 5, I trusted in your covenant loyalty, your chesed, your steadfast love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. So the psalmist is saying, I'm not out of the pit yet, but I know you'll come through for me. Now that's also a little subtle pressure on God, right? There's a taste of, oh, see what this core testimony, the witnessing I can do for you is going to be like. I really like it. It's ingenious. And then the vow of praise, again, in the last verse of Psalm 13, a vow in anticipation of deliverance. I will sing to the Lord because he has been good to me. And you ask all of those accusations and all that despair to this hopeful stance for the future. Well, maybe the priest says, God has heard you, go in peace. Maybe the lament serves as a pep talk for the psalmist. Maybe there's a little bargaining, but hey, we bargain all the time in our liturgy. We confess our sin, and then we have pastoral prayers to ask for something. If that's not bargaining, I don't know what is. Okay. So here we see the power of the psalm laments. Laments are legitimate complaints in faith to God when we experience God's absence. They're vehicles of honesty. They are expressions of our dependence upon God, certainly, because otherwise, why would we bother to pray? A lament does not give up on God. And for me, a lament is the flip side of the coin of Romans 8. Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. And then that list of terrible traumas, right? So just as God does not give up on us, we do not give up on God through the lament. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and ask if anyone has any questions. I know I raced through a good deal of the psalm lament structure, but I really wanted you to feel how lamenting is a process. And we do not recover from grief in the course of one lament. We do not. Again, here's where the congregation comes in to hold those anticipations of deliverance and praising for us until we can get to that place. And most psychologists say that after a significant loss or after trauma, Well, no, trauma is longer. After a significant loss, it takes a minimum of 2 years to get back on track, whatever that track looks like for you. 2 years. But in our culture, we want things immediately. Pop an Advil and be better in 30 minutes, right? Doesn't work that way. These losses take time to repair. Any questions? Hi, TC. Shout out. Questions, anyone? Yes, Chuck.
Hi, just a comment. Your comment about the platitudes reminded me of a sermon series that Mark Schaefer, when he was the United Methodist chaplain, put on the website. I think it's probably still there. I think it's like the 11 or 12 lies you'll hear in church. That's just...
Mark Schaefer was a student of mine, and he took Psalms for me, and he preached a sermon on laments. And one of the requirements for the Psalm class is that we create a service totally built on the Psalms. He's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely, Chuck. Yeah, thank you. And again, Will, I can't see everyone on the chat, so if anybody else has a question.
All right. I'm not seeing...
Sean?
Yeah, can you go back for just a second on the enemies piece? Because I don't know, whenever I'm using a lament psalm for my own purposes, right? And I get to those pieces, I guess I just have trouble like giving myself permission to think of people in my life as enemies, because I always have that immediate reaction of like, oh wait, no, like I'm supposed to be gracious. I'm supposed to be loving of these people, even if I see them as enemies. Like, can you just speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. That's a very important question. We are caught up short because we're taught to love our enemies, right? And when you read verses like, let them be like the snail that dissolves in a slime, or Psalm 137, daughter Babylon, you devastator, blessed are they who take your little ones and dash their heads against the rock, right? We say, oh my goodness, we would never do that. But I remind people of 9/11 and our calls for bombing Afghanistan into a parking lot, which would, correct me if I'm wrong, cause a whole lot of collateral damage to women and children. So we wouldn't physically be taking little heads and dashing them against the rock, but we'd be asking our military to drop bombs to do that. So I will quote Walter Harrelson, may he rest in peace, who was raised Southern Baptist and was one of my main professors at Vanderbilt in my PhD work. And he said, how do you command someone to love? And you cannot command someone to love unless there has been a complete airing of what it is that you hate about the person. And to pretend that what we feel, the rage we feel inside for an enemy, be it a collective enemy or a personal enemy, and to pretend it's not there is totally dishonest, particularly if part of our core testimony is that God knows what we pray before we pray it. So we don't walk into a church and suddenly leave what we're really feeling outside the church doors. So again, I talk about the worship service as a holding environment for honest expressions of hatred, because until we recognize that they're there, they are not going to go away. And we are fooling ourselves to think that they will.
So we have time for 2 more questions, and I see that Patricia has raised her hand and Sarah has raised her hand. So why don't we start, Patricia, with your question, and then we'll go to Sarah.
And Patricia, just before you say that, one more thing for Sean. I want us to offer up that anger on the altar before God and invite God in to work through it and transform it. Sorry, Patricia.
That's fine. I'm just reading a book because of this Smart Politics Facebook group that I'm on called Defeating Hate by somebody who was a former white supremacist and really nasty, who has been since then bringing people out of it. And he talks about exactly this kind of thing because they were pretty bad. And you have to recognize what they've done. They have to recognize it. But he is being hate is an action verb. It is not a feeling. That's something else that I was just reading. And I think that's the key to it. It is what you do.
Thank you. And that is very much rooted in Hebrew Bible. There is no separation between emotions and actions in Hebrew Bible. And the problem comes in with the dualism of the Greco-Roman world when we start talking about mind and body and soul, and we compartmentalize. So in Hebrew Bible, these laments have actions attached to them. They're feelings that result in action, like take their little ones and dash them against the rocks, right? That has to be offered up and worked through. It cannot be suppressed. And I think part of the white supremacy movement is this feeling that they have not been heard. Of course, they don't recognize that they've been part of white privilege for so long either. It's very complicated. But Patricia, that's a great intersection. Thank you for that. And one more? Will, you said there was one more?
Sarah?
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Sarah.
My question, it kind of touches on Sean's, but also disenfranchised grief, I think, and that's guilt in lamenting. We might have guilt associated with thinking of people as enemies, but also guilt in lamenting for what society would say is like too long. And I ask the question as I surround myself with my grandma's shawl, who passed over a year ago at the age of 99. And sometimes it takes quite a while, as you shared with your brother's experience.
Yes, sometimes. Say more about the guilt. I'm not quite clear, Sarah, where you're going with that.
So, and that can be connected perhaps to all of the platitudes. And so if there's that like get over it type of response, I can also connect this to, I had a grandfather who passed on Christmas morning more than 12 years ago. And I've had that sort of like, it's time to get over it, but you can't always like control when the grief wave happens. And so giving yourself permission to just lament as the emotions happen rather than trying to like box it in and shove it out.
Thanks. So guilt in terms of a timetable, you should be done, right? Society judges. Get over it. Yes, absolutely. And I will tell you, my brother died in 1978. And whenever I cross any of the bridges into DC or I'm at the Kennedy Center, I think of him. And at the Kennedy Center, if I see somebody from the back who looked like my brother when he was 23, I'm almost in tears. He died in 1978. There's a hole in your heart that will never close, period. Yeah. And I'm so glad you have her shawl. That's wonderful. Wonderful.
Well, friends, as we conclude our time together today, we are so glad that you're with us. Dr. Hopkins, a special thanks to you for all of the ways that you have helped lead us through this exploration of the Lament Psalms and for the gift of your experience and your knowledge and wisdom. Thank you so very much. Lament, as we've learned today, is not an expression of faithlessness in God, but an act of profound faith toward God. As we've concluded each of these lectures, we've offered this blessing written by John O'Donohue and called For Suffering, which we now offer to you. May you be blessed in the holy names of those who, without knowing it, help to carry and lighten your pain. May you know serenity when you are called to enter the house of suffering. May a window of light always surprise you. May you be granted the wisdom to avoid false resistance. When suffering knocks on the door of your life, may you glimpse its eventual gifts, and may you be able to receive the fruits of suffering. May memory bless and protect you with the hard-earned life past travail, to remind you that you have survived before, and though the darkness is now deep, you will soon see approaching light. May the grace of time heal your wounds. May you know that though the storm may rage, not a hair of your head will be harmed. Until next time, friends, be gentle with yourselves, and blessings on the journey.